another episode of the Evoke cast. I'm your host, Scott Johnston. Today, I'm joined by Roxanne Vogel. Roxy is a PhD candidate in exercise physiology at Southern Cross University in Australia, where her research focuses on nutrition interventions to augment human performance in environmental extremes, including heat, cold, and hypoxia. She holds a certification from the National Strength and Conditioning Association. She's certified by the American College of Sports Medicine as an exercise physiologist, along with a few other titles. Since 2017, she's been the Nutrition and Performance Research Manager at GU Energy Labs, where she oversees the brand's performance lab and works with elite athletes to optimize nutrition for performance, health, and longevity. As a mountaineer and ultra-endurance athlete, in 2019, she became the first person in history to summit Mount Everest door-to-door in 2 weeks. And in 2020, she completed the 7 summits by successfully climbing to the top of the highest peak on each continent. She has spent this past decade researching nutrition and its impact on body composition, athletic performance, and cognitive function. Roxanne currently resides and trains in Mammoth Lakes, California. She's currently training for the Tour de Gent race that will be in mid-September. She's working with Evoke coach Luke Nelson, who was 9th in that race a few years ago. And if this isn't enough credibility, give her enough credibility for her endurance capability, this race is 330 kilometers long with 24,000 meters of elevation gain and loss. So that should put things into perspective. So welcome, Roxy. Thanks for making the time to talk with me today.
Yep, my pleasure, Scott. Glad to be here.
Yeah. Well, that's a little background for our listeners. Roxy and I have crossed paths for almost 10 years. When we first met, I'm pretty sure it was San Francisco Patagonia store during the book tour for training for the new alpinism. Was that, you recall that?
Yeah, I think that was the first time we met in person. I think we were already working together in some capacity when I was training for Everest. But yeah, that was the first time I got to see you face to face.
Yeah. And so getting back to that Everest story, so about 5 years ago, in preparation for her Everest smash and grab, she was coached mostly by Evoke coach Seth Kina. I worked alongside Seth a little bit, so I definitely had a front row seat to her training. And this left several impressions on me. And probably the first and most indelible one was that this woman is an absolute beast. I'm sorry, I hope that doesn't embarrass you too much. I mean, beast in a good way. So she definitely has one of the highest overall work capacities of any athlete I've ever worked with. Seth and I kept incredulously saying to one another, we can't make her tired. And another thing I really enjoyed about Roxanne working with her is that she's really an outside the box thinker when it comes to trying some pretty novel training interventions. And I want to have time today to give listeners a kind of a quick rundown on some of those training interventions and also how they played out for you on that Everest climb. But I also brought Roxy here today because she knows that I'm always curious to learn stuff. And from time to time, she sends me emails with studies and other little tidbits that I enjoy reading. And most recently, she sent over a metadata study that looked at the cross-adaptations of heat training to performance in hypoxic environments, such as high altitudes. So Roxy, let's dive in. Why don't you give us a summary of what that study found?
Yeah, so the study you're referring to was an exploratory meta-analysis. So it just came out in, I want to say, February of this year. So looking at cross-adaptation between heat stress and hypoxia. So really, how does acclimatizing or adapting to the stress of heat transfer to adaptations for hypoxia, which has always been something that fascinates me and something I've used in my own training. But this is really the first time that we've seen kind of a synthesis of the existing literature over the last 10 years, because really that's all we have so far is the last 10 years worth of actual experimental research in this area. So again, it's a study of studies. So it looked at 9 different studies that were currently available. So a total of about 80 participants across those 9 studies, which honestly isn't that much or isn't that many when you think about it in the grand scheme of things. But It's what we have. So they looked at different heat acclimation strategies. So anywhere ranging from about 4 days to 14 days worth of either consecutive days of heat exposure or non-consecutive days of heat exposure. But on average, we're looking at like 90 minutes of training in heat. So that could be on a bike, that could be on a treadmill, and temperatures looking around 100 to 104 degrees, so pretty hot. So, taking these heat training protocols and then testing the folks who did them in a hypoxic environment. So whether that was normobaric or simulated altitude or hypobaric, which is real altitude, hypobaric hypoxia, testing them for how they performed either at submaximal or maximal all-out exercise intensities. And so what they found was that there did seem to be a benefit in terms of the amount of oxygen saturation they had at rest following the heat acclimation, but then also looking at a decrease in heart rate during submaximal exercise. So, translating that into lower cardiovascular strain at those moderate intensity exercise domains. And even, not surprisingly, a reduced core temperature during exercise at submaximal exercise intensities. So those were kind of the main takeaways of the study. That's not to say that's the only thing that any of these individual studies found, but that's what the synthesis of all of the research studies, those are the most beneficial effects that they found that were significant for heat to hypoxia cross acclimatization.
And I noted one of the things I noticed, or maybe I overlooked as I read it, was that, I mean, they were testing proxies for performance, but there was no like time trial, let's say, before or after. Did I misread or overlook anything? And if that's the case, why do you suppose they don't, in these kinds of tests, when the thing that I think most of us would be interested in, yes, it's kind of cool that your heart rate's lower, but what we'd really like to know is, can you move faster uphill? And do you think, did I miss something, first of all?
Yeah, so in the paper itself, it outlines the different tests they did to test either submaximal or maximal intensity exercise. And they're all a little bit different. Obviously, the protocol and design of each of the studies is a little bit different. So, in some of them, there was a time trial, like a cycling time trial in one, or
Okay.
a stress test at submaximal intensities in another. So it really just depends on the individual study. And so when you're comparing them all, it's a little bit difficult to draw, finite conclusions across the whole if they all have slightly different tests that they did. So that's why the main takeaways are like kind of this, like you see increase in oxygen saturation and decrease in heart rate, but nothing too granular in terms of like what are the exact performance improvements. That would be more at the individual study level.
Okay, because I think that's what's going to be most interesting to listeners, and certainly most interesting to me. Would you be able to, from your more in-depth reading of the study than I did, obviously, be able to like make a general statement about, okay, did this improve performance, 0.1%, or did it improve it 10%? I mean, are we looking at significant gains in performance in a low oxygen atmosphere or training or protocol?
Yeah, I think, it's a little challenging to look at the individual level study and say there was like a 5% increase in VO2 max or 5% in increase in peak power output at this intensity or this percentage of VO2 max. But I think overall, on the whole, it's pretty safe to say that there are these cardiovascular improvements that reduce the physiological strain in hypoxia that would otherwise be there without this heat acclimation training. So essentially, you're making the work easier on your body at altitude than would be otherwise available to you. And that's not to say that you can't reduce that strain with traditional hypoxic training. It's just that heat acclimation tends to be a much faster process. So anywhere from 4 to say 14 days, as opposed to you think about altitude training, it's like 7 to 21 days plus to see those kind of
Yeah.
benefits. And it's like you're either in real altitude all the time or you have to simulate that. And that's very many hours a day. Like I think back to my training and it's like, I think I spent 13 hours a day in either a hypoxic tent or in a hypoxic chamber at work every day for 3 months.
Yeah, that's pretty demanding. And in fact, there's a funny little story kind of related to that, is that after you did that climb on Everest, there were a number of people that approached us saying, I want to do that too. And then when I would explain to them what besides your pretty phenomenal physical abilities to begin with, when I explained to them the lengths you went to allowed you to be ready to essentially go door to door in 2 weeks, I think people realize, oh, this isn't for everyone. This is not, it takes some really special. I mean, you had a great opportunity because work had a hypoxic room and you had a hypoxic tent at home and that sort of thing. But yeah, I think I burst a few people's bubbles when I found out how hard this was going to be for them.
Correct. It was quite an investment in time and energy. And I like to say it's a good thing I was, living alone and single at the time because I don't know how anybody else with a family or significant other would handle that amount of confinement in a hypoxic environment. But I think one interesting thing going back to the study is that one area where we can see, more of like a put a number on it, variable improvement would be plasma volume expansion. So that's one of the main reasons why heat training is so effective for not only, the hypoxic cross-acclimation aspect, but also just for performance at sea level and in thermoneutral environments is you get this plasma expansion effect in your blood. And so with this 4 to 14 days worth of heat exposure, they were looking at 4 to 15% plasma volume expansion. And so that's what's really driving this adaptation process. And you get this upregulation of things like heat shock proteins and hypoxia inducible factor. And that's what allows you to make that leap from the heat adaptation to the hypoxic adaptation.
So I'm curious about that because I've used heat training with some of the elite runners I worked with, in particular, quite a lot with Tom Evans, and excuse me, but we combined we did passive and active heat training, but we combined that with artificial hypoxic. He was sleeping in a tent.
Mhm.
And so explain to me just how does just increasing the plasma volume increase or improve performance at sea level? I would assume you would need to also increase the hematocrit or the red blood cell levels to go along with that. Am I mistaken in that?
It's kind of a both and situation. So with heat training, plasma volume is one of the first things to actually make a move, a noticeable adjustment. And that can happen within 3 days of repeated heat exposure. It's pretty impressive. So at that point, you're not seeing an increase in red blood cells. It's just too soon for that to move. That response takes much longer. But with just plasma volume expansion alone, I mean, you have an increase in stroke volume, and then you have a resulting decrease in heart rate at submaximal levels. So you're just seeing a greater efficiency of the cardiovascular system, and that's what's translating into those improvements, regardless of the environment. Really, it's just a more efficient system when you have more plasma volume to work with.
Okay, so you're the physiologist, so I'm going to have to ask a few questions about that
Mhm.
because I'm sure if I'm confused about this, other people will be too. And so if I'm not sure, like, why does stroke volume necessarily increase if you have more blood volume, plasma volume?
Yeah, great question. So it's this process known as like a preload. So with the heart contraction, you're basically pumping blood from one side out the left ventricle and into the systemic circulation. So if you have a greater preload because you have a greater volume of plasma pushing up into that, right side of the heart, then you get a greater forceful contraction. So it's a greater stroke volume, and then you need fewer heartbeats to pump that extra amount of blood. So you get
Okay.
increase in preload, a bigger, more forceful contraction, and so you're getting more blood pumping out.
Okay, so now that makes some sense to me. So that would improve or increase even if your hematocrit didn't change. Or is there a drop in hematocrit? Is there a little bit of a dilution initially? because as you said, your bone marrow can't keep up probably with the increased volume initially. It'll take it a few weeks probably to catch up.
Right. And so that's, yeah, so that when your body catches on to that, dilution factor, then it's going to upregulate that erythropoietic response and increase red blood cell production as a result. So that's why that's kind of a delayed response to that initial increase in plasma volume.
Okay, well that makes a lot of sense to me now. And then if we tack on some artificial hypoxic exposure, like sleeping in, hypoxico tent or something like that, is that going to be kind of like a double boost? Because then you're going to be getting the increased plasma volume and you're going to be stimulating red blood cell production.
I think it's hard to say whether there's like a definite, synergistic effect or whether it's just like you're stimulating these heat shock proteins, which also help to stabilize hypoxia inducible factor, which is going to drive some of those more like erythropoiesis and, increasing red blood cells, increasing blood vessel creation. So you're increasing heat shock proteins, but those also stabilize hypoxia inducible factor. So essentially, it's hard to say whether it's the heat alone that's doing that or if it's the combination of both and to what extent one is or the other is contributing to this process. So probably synergistic. We don't know to what extent that synergy exists or, like which is weighted more heavily than the other.
But if you did have more volume, I mean, obviously there's a limit to what your hematocrit level can be safely, especially when you go to altitude, and certainly legally in some instances, some sports events would regulate that. But if you had an increased volume that initially drove your hematocrit down, that would make room for more red blood cells before you reached either a dangerous or a legal limit of hematocrit. Does that logic make some sense?
That makes some sense. And I would say that even if you're looking at traditional hypoxic training and an increase in hemoglobin or red blood cell production, it's a pretty slow and small process. Like it's not like you're going to double your amount of red blood
No.
cells or anything. It's 1% increase in hemoglobin per 100 hours of altitude exposure. So it's slow and it's small. So
Does the altitude matter? I mean, the like it's the difference between, let's say, sleeping at 3,000 meters and sleeping at 5,000 meters. Would it speed up if you were sleeping at a higher altitude?
it seems as though it does. So the
Mhm.
dose is dependent on both the intensity of the exposure, so what altitude, but also the duration. And there's still some debate over the best way to quantify this. So there's been one proposal to do this in terms of kilometer hours. So it's looking at the total altitude that you're at divided by 1,000, and you times that by the number of hours you spent there, and that gives you this kilometer hour number. And so looking at kilometer hours in excess of 1 or 2,000 would be a place that people want to be in terms of increasing hemoglobin by somewhere upwards of 3%. So that's one way of looking at it. So in that case, yes, if you increase the altitude, you're definitely going to increase that number. So you can
Yeah, that
maybe
makes sense.
decrease
Okay.
the amount of time you spend there. But again, it's still
It's
in the
still,
thousands of hours, right? So it's like
yeah,
you have to spend a lot of time no matter what
interesting.
altitude.
So 1% in, so let's just pick 4 or 5,000 meters simulated, 1% gain in hematocrit per 100 hours
Hemoglobin.
of hemoglobin. Oh, okay. So let's say, so we might be moving, yeah, that's not moving the needle very far at all, is it?
No, but it's a pretty tightly regulated, number anyway. So
Yeah. Huh. Okay. Well, that's pretty interesting. So what does that say then? And I'm going off topic here, so forgive me, but I think this is something that I'm certainly interested in. So what does that say then about, like, you spent hundreds of hours in a hypoxic environment,
mhm.
and many of the Everest guide services these days are even requiring their customers to have spent a certain number of hours. I mean, how many of them are hitting 100 hours in their preparation, or even, I mean, the 1% seems like an awfully small change in hemoglobin levels, which I would think would be kind of a course. Wouldn't there be a pretty similar increase in hematocrit? If you have a single digit increase in hemoglobin, are you looking at a single digit increase in hematocrit levels?
I think it would be corresponding to a slightly larger percentage increase in hematocrit because the numbers are pretty different. So hemoglobin looking at anywhere from like 12 to 14, and hematocrit looking more in that like 48 to 50% range.
Right.
But, I think
But
that's why expeditions have traditionally taken so long. And this is why I wanted to see if it could be done in a shorter amount of time. But like the part that takes so long is not climbing the mountain itself, right? It's like the process of acclimatizing down low, and the trek in is part of that. So it's like you spend 10 days trekking in and gradually acclimatizing and gaining that exposure over time. And then you spend time at different camps going up and down the mountain. Whereas you could probably climb the whole thing in one day if altitude wasn't an issue, right? It's not
yeah.
like that far of a journey.
Well, it just makes me wonder though, if we're talking about single digit gains in red blood cell counts, then that doesn't sound like very much but yet and I know that when you go to altitude, there's a huge gain in performance. And we also know that hematocrit is not the only thing that happens in acclimatization periods, but it kind of makes me think it's maybe not the most important thing if because we don't I don't know if I ever talked to you about this, but I think I've never said this publicly, but I was part of a NATO Special Operations Winter Warfare Symposium, I don't know, 7, 8 years ago. And one of the presenters there was Dr. Robert Roach at Colorado University, who's a physiologist there, and he may be one of the world's leading experts on acclimatization.
Mm-hmm.
And he talked about a study that they did. I'll probably do a pretty poor job of summarizing this, but I think it'll be good enough to get the point across, where he took, I think, maybe a dozen members of the University of Oregon cross-country running team and an entire genetics lab down to Ecuador, and they lived at, I think, 16 or 18,000 feet at this observatory for 2 weeks. And he wanted to keep the exposure short enough so that there wouldn't be enough time for red blood cells to increase in those first 2 weeks. And on day number one, he had these kids do an uphill time trial, which you can imagine how that felt, coming from Eugene, Oregon at sea level and going right to whatever 16,000 feet. And then on day 14, they did another uphill time trial, and the average improvement was 25% with no change in average hematocrit.
Mm-hmm.
And so his presentation to us was about half the human genome was affected, but they didn't really know what most of those genes did. But what I took away from that as a non-physiologist and certainly no kind of an expert in this was, wow, the story behind acclimatization is much, much bigger than hematocrit, increasing red blood cell. Because in this case, these athletes' red blood cell count didn't really improve much. So it just makes you wonder. So we're spending a lot of time and energy and money, and in many cases compromising training by having people sleep in a hypoxic environment because they don't recover well for a 1% gain in hematocrit. And I'm just thinking, wow, is this, I mean, correct? Tell me what I'm missing here.
I think that's definitely a very interesting study, and Robert Roach is very famous in this area, in this field, and greatly respected. I think, yes, it's important to remember that there are many other processes going on in the whole acclimatization process to altitude. So, whether that's the the ventilatory effect. When you first get to altitude, which is within minutes of arriving, you start to increase your respiration rate, whether that's the ability of the body to extract oxygen as it's passing through the lungs, like your diffusion capability. There are very many systems involved beyond just what's the oxygen carrying capacity of your red blood cells and the quantity of your red blood cells. So to be fair, I think, yes, there is some utility in this pre-acclimation, whether that's using hypoxic tense or actual hypoxic exposure, or whether that's using some form of heat acclimation or a combination of any of those things. And it might not be reflected in the red blood cells or the hematocrit, but we're still making incremental progress towards hypoxic acclimatization.
And it certainly seems to be effective. The anecdotal evidence suggests, I mean, I've talked to a number of guide services, and the reason they're requiring it is they see those people that come to them pre-acclimatized in an artificial environment performing much, much better on the mountain. So there's obviously something to it that may not even be related to, just red blood cell count.
Correct. And I don't think you can really underestimate the value in just decreasing someone's susceptibility to acute mountain sickness or things like, cerebral edema or pulmonary edema. And that's another area where this actual heat adaptation, cross acclimatization might be beneficial. And that's one of the things the article points out is like, this could be useful for people who are in the military, who are, they have jobs like in mining where they don't have the luxury of time to prepare for high altitude, but they have to get ready as best they can and at least decrease the likelihood that they're going to get sick once they're there. Like this could be useful for that as well.
Yeah, that is fascinating that the adaptation happens as quickly as you said. Within 2 weeks, you see pretty significant improvement. Would it be? I mean, maybe you don't have these studies didn't generally go longer than that, but do you think there would be an advantage for, let's say, someone who doesn't have access to, a tent to sleep in? Do you think there'd be any advantage to maintaining that heat protocol for longer than a week to 2 weeks?
I do think there is benefit beyond that, shorter. I guess this would be termed medium term heat acclimation. I think anything less than 7 days is considered short term heat acclimation. Anyways, nomenclature. But yes, I do think like they pointed out one study that was extended over 5.5 weeks of heat acclimation. So this was active heat acclimation where people are actually exercising for anywhere from 60 to 90 minutes in a heated environment. And that's when they did start to see some of those increases in things like red blood cell count. So I think with the longer sustained exposures, you are going to start to see some of those additional erythropoietic responses where we get the increase in hematocrit as well.
And one of the things that I mentioned to you in an email that I didn't have any knowledge of heat acclimation, but when I started working with Tom a few years ago to prepare for some of his races, we were lucky enough to be able to get some help from one of the high performance director of one of the top Tour de France teams. And of course, those guys race in terrible heat a lot. And so they spend a lot of time preparing for that heat exposure. And so he gave me some of the basics of what was going on in terms of plasma volume increase and some of the benefits that came with that. But one of the things that he told me was that this adaptation goes away very fast. Like you just pee off the extra plasma pretty quickly. Is that your understanding as well?
Yeah, I think the rate of decay for heat adaptation or heat acclimation is pretty quick. I think, it can persist for up to a week or two. It will gradually decline. I want to say the decrements are like 1 to 2% per day once you stop exposures.
Okay.
Um, because yeah, I've done similar heat training protocols for folks who are getting ready for hot weather races like Western states. And we traditionally will stop the like training heat exposures a couple weeks out along with the beginning of the taper, but you'll keep up some passive exposures just as little top ups for like, once or twice a week in the last 2 weeks before the race, because you are going to get that decay, but you want to be able to preserve it a little bit without stressing the body additionally, during the taper.
Okay, so that fits. Although he was pretty adamant that we keep it up. Like when Tom did, he kept up before Western States. He trained in the heat right up to the day before the race. Just bundled himself up when he was going out for an easy run. But it was interesting because he did a lot of his training at home at Loughborough University, where there's a heat there's a heat, what do they call, lab, heat lab. And he was able to do kind of a lot of controlled training inside there. And I got to see the data core temperatures and the temperature of the room. And it was remarkable how fast his core temperature, like when he first started and the room was, 40 plus degrees, just a little over 40 degrees centigrade. I mean, he was struggling, even cycling at a very low power output. And by the end, the room was 50 degrees, which is, I don't know, that's what, like 120,
Yeah,
115. Yeah.
that's incredibly hot.
And he would actually do a workout on the treadmill, and his core temperature wouldn't even hit 40. It was really incredible over just a matter of a few weeks, the adaptations that we saw. I didn't know anything about it before that, but I was really blown away. So this sounds to me like quite an actionable and efficacious training intervention that someone could use, obviously, whether it's mountaineering or trail running. I mean, what kind of controls do you think it's necessary for people to use, like one of those core temperature sensors that fits on your heart rate chest strap, or do you think there's certain controls and protocols that ought to be observed, or do you think people just go sit in a sauna for 20 minutes a day?
Yeah, gosh. Well, I think to be clear and not to confuse anyone who might be listening, the study we're talking about in this paper, the meta-analysis, all of those studies were using active heat acclimation, as in these folks were exercising in the heat, which is different than passive, right? So you're maybe sitting in a sauna, you're taking a hot bath, a much different approach, although similar adaptations can be made, arguably. So I just want to point that out because I don't want folks to think that we're talking about sitting in a sauna and getting all these same benefits, although it is likely that there could be similar effects from passive heat acclimation. But
Excuse me, let me interrupt real
Sure.
quick. So the protocol that we use with Tom, and I've done it a few times now, is to start with passive. And then, so maybe two times a week with passive. And then after that, for a couple of weeks, we'd move to one passive and one active. And eventually we end up with 2 or 3 active sessions in a week, as a way to gradually introduce it, which seemed to be pretty easy and tolerable for him.
Yes, and I think that that's absolutely a smart way to go about it, is to start with passive exposures, and especially if you can put those, right up against a workout. So you do your workout in thermoneutral environment, whatever your environment happens to be, and then immediately after, while your core temperature is already elevated from your workout, go sit in the sauna for starting with maybe 20 minutes and then work yourself up to about 40, 45 minutes max. That's definitely one area where we see improvements in all those cardiovascular variables we were talking about with just the passive exposure of 20 to 40 minutes post-exercise traditionally. So yes, I would say that seems like a very smart way to work your way into it and then transition into, the active training heat exposure, where if you don't have access to a heat chamber, which many of us don't, maybe that means bundling up in extra layers and going out for a run in the midday heat, things like that. To be fair, all of this is very dependent on how well you tolerate heat. Some of us tolerate heat better than others, dependent on hydration status, how tired you are that day. If you go out and you're already not feeling good, I would say probably not the best idea to.
That's not a good day to add
Right.
more stress. Yeah.
Right. Kind of
Sure.
like in your workouts, on Training Peaks, you might be like, if you're not feeling good on this day, do not do this workout, like
Yeah.
switch to an easy run. full disclosure, I mean, heat it'll sap your energy no matter how it's applied. Even if you're doing it passively after workout, like you will still feel more tired after that full day versus had you just done the workout by itself. So proceed with caution, start with passive heat exposures, non-consecutive days, maybe 3 times a week, 20 to 40 minutes after workout. Then after a couple weeks of that, you could progress to the active exercise scenario.
And so I want to switch gears. I mean, well, actually, I want to maybe before we switch gears, you used this protocol, you added heat along with your altitude exposure when you were preparing for Everest. And that was the first time, honestly, that I'd ever heard about it. And this was what, 2019, roughly? 18, 19, I think we were training together. So that you must have read something that made you go, aha, I'm going to try this.
Yes, it was one of those early studies. So again, in this meta-analysis, it's looking at the last 10 years worth of research, and it was one of those early studies. I think the first one we have is from 2012, where it showed the cross-acclimation potential of heat to hypoxia. And I was at that point looking for any and every tool in the toolbox that I could use to, make sure I didn't die once I got to base camp at 17,000 feet and started going straight up the mountain. So I was a little bit of, N of one experiment on myself to see if all of these things could work together. And it seems to have been beneficial. And I actually learned to really enjoy the heat passive exposure after my workouts. It was like my treat at the end of the workout. So yeah.
And well, I often think, being a coach and not a scientist, I put a lot of credence, actually, maybe more credence in those N of one experiments, anecdotal evidence, especially when you do it. I mean, it's when it's not just an N of one, maybe it's only an N of four, people that you do the same, some sort of training intervention with, and you see positive results. You go, something about this works, even if there's no study to justify it, no science behind it. Well, there's probably some science, nobody has discovered what it is. But so you clearly felt that something was working for you. And then the evidence, by the fact that you could, go door to door from San Francisco to summit of Everest and back in 2 weeks, it clearly worked. I mean, it was all, I can't imagine that it had a negative effect, or you wouldn't have been able to do that. And so this to me points to, one of the things I mentioned in the introduction, you definitely think outside the box, which I really commend and appreciate, because I've taken some of the approaches that are sort of outside the mainstream, the way I've approached coaching and training. But the fact that this paid off for you, it's like, oh, whoopee, that's great. I mean, it really did work. And even if at that time, there wasn't much science to, justify it, let's say. And so do you think that this kind of self-experimentation, I mean, we're not talking about, doing anything too drastic, but do you put a lot of weight in, like, saying, okay, I'm just going to try this and see if it works for me?
Yeah, I think within reason. And to your point, I think practice in the field of sports science often precedes, the actual experimental studies that can support a hypothesis. So we have practitioners out there working with athletes, coaches working with athletes who are like, let's try this and see if it sticks, and it does. And then us researchers will be like, oh, we should probably go and do a study and see if that works out in a laboratory setting. So yeah, I think the self-experimentation and just doing things to try them and see if it works is a great way to find out what can be done. And I feel like I lost a little bit of your question there.
I thought that's what I wanted to know. Is it like, and I often get this. I mean, you're the nutrition person and I'm not. I often have people asking me, what kind of should I use, this supplement or that supplement, or try this dietary regimen or whatnot. And I often tell them, give it a try. I don't know. And I think there's so much conflicting evidence when it comes to nutrition. Anyone who can find a study that says you should do something can probably find 4 studies that say you shouldn't do that same thing. So it's a very confusing landscape for people. But my recommendation has often been give it a try. And if after a few weeks or a month you can't tell if it's doing anything, then it's probably not doing anything for you. I mean, if you're not noticing, I mean, the thing that scientists are interested in maybe using those proxies that I began this conversation with and measuring something like VO2 max or blood volume or whatever. But athletes are typically only interested in performance. And so what I will tell people is if you don't notice a performance increase or you're recovering better, then what's the point of taking it? It would just, I mean, I know I'm probably stepping over the line here with a nutritionist. Give me your
And
thoughts on that idea.
yeah, I think nutrition is even more of can be a slippery slope, because there can be so many variables that influence like how a supplement is actually absorbed and utilized in the body. There can be responders and non-responders, as in most things, but I think it's very susceptible to individual differences. And I guess one thing I should point out before we keep going in our conversation is that the study that we keep referring back to, this meta-analysis, was only male participants. And
Yeah,
so we can't draw any definitive conclusions in terms of females, or even this is looking at mostly recreationally trained folks,
right.
so not looking at elite or high level athletes. So I think that's another thing to consider when you're looking at research of any kind, is like, who are the people they're testing? Is that who you're interested in? So,
Yeah,
just because a study says one thing about this particular population doesn't mean that those same results extend to other populations. And I think that that's one of the most important things to consider when you're looking at any kind of new supplement or any kind of new training protocol, is like, okay, well, does this apply to the situation that I'm in and that I care about?
yeah. I've definitely encountered that in the past I mean, people will throw up a study where they're taking, untrained college students and running them through some training protocol for 4 weeks and going, oh, look at that. It increased their VO2 max. So this must be the next great thing we should all be doing for our training. Well, probably not actually, because these, almost anything you do with a relatively unfit person is going to increase their VO2 max. So,
By like
um,
50% too,
yeah, you could
because
easily, yeah, for people who are not fit at all.
yeah.
So yeah, I find that peculiar that they do that sort of that actually passes muster in the scientific community sometimes. Um, well, I do want to ask before I run out of time with you, and because I appreciate your taking the time with me, I want to change direction a little bit because I'm often asked about ice baths. And so my question is, if extreme heat or this heat training protocol or heat acclimatization protocol has that kind of an effect, is it possible that cold exposure could do something similar? Is that maybe one of the, or maybe you could tell me more, like why is all of a sudden ice baths such a huge deal? And you hear about them all the time.
Yes. I think, okay, so there is a small body of research, first of all, relating cold exposure to hypoxic cross-acclimation. It's a much smaller body of work than the heat to hypoxia cross-acclimation research, but there is some research to suggest that, the benefits you get from short-term cold exposure, which in cold exposure, things are very short. Typically, it's like a few minutes of cold exposure. If you're talking about whole body, is enough to drive some sort of adaptation. And usually that's going to be at the sympathetic nervous system level. So you get to attenuate this cold shock response that you will initially have when you're first exposed to a very cold body of water, or very cold air, if you're in one of those cryotherapy chambers. So you do see with these repeated and just, even a few repeated cold exposures, you start to attenuate this cold shock response. So you're not hyperventilating, your heart's not racing immediately.
Mm.
You basically become more tolerant of the cold stress. Fun fact, I did do some
Yeah.
cold training for when I went to Antarctica for 5 weeks. And so I am somewhat familiar with both the research and the actual practical application of cold exposure. But I think to your point, it's become way more popular in the past 5 years. In the lay press, on social media, people are doing cold plunges and they have their cold tubs in their backyard and things like that. And I think, those folks are not so much interested in does this help with hypoxia pre-acclimatization. I think some of the benefits that those folks are after are looking more at the neurocognitive benefits that might be part of the situation, or even looking at some of the metabolic benefits that could be part of cold uh, exposure adaptation. So we do know that cold exposure increases both the quantity and the activation of this type of fat called brown fat, which is a more metabolically active fatty tissue compared to what most of us have is white fat. So it was initially thought that we have brown fat when we're born. It's insulative. It can actually produce its own heat, metabolically active, but we lose that after we're born because we don't really need it. But you can actually increase brown fat if you do repeated cold exposure, or even if you live in a cold environment and you're kind of exposed to cold temperatures all the time on purpose. So just like walking around in a t-shirt in the cold, which some folks do. But that's how you increase this brown fat, and brown fat can help with all heaps of things, but metabolic benefits. So I think that's one area. And I think the other area, the neurocognitive benefits. So the other thing that happens when you have cold exposure, an acute cold exposure, is you get this huge increase in norepinephrine. So norepinephrine increases focus and attention. It can also modulate the immune system. So you might get some immune system benefits down the road from repeated exposures. So yeah, I think altogether, kind of this new wave of interest in cold water immersion and cold exposure is looking probably more at those benefits as opposed to any sort of cross-acclimation response.
Yeah. Okay. And what about the use of maybe not ice baths, but cold water immersion to enhance to speed recovery? I mean, while we're on this topic, I can't let you go without telling me a little bit about that, because I mean, it does have a powerful anti-inflammatory effect, if I remember reading correctly. But also from again, you're the physiologist, so correct me here if I'm wrong, but isn't inflammation one of the triggers for a lot of the adaptations that we're looking for as athletes, the training?
Yes,
So
that's
you have this conflict kind of, yeah.
absolutely. So it's kind of a similar, like parallels can be drawn between the use of, say, vitamin C and vitamin E antioxidants around exercise. We used to think like, oh, antioxidant effects, we should use it because we don't want inflammation and all of that. But some inflammation is good as part of the adaptive response to exercise. And so now we know better, and that we don't necessarily want to take these antioxidants kind of around workouts. We want to separate that. Same thing with cold exposure. There is a good body of evidence to support this anti-inflammatory benefit of cold exposure, especially after exercise or endurance exercise specifically. But you do want to have some time and space for that inflammatory process to occur after exercise, because again, that's what's driving the adaptation process. It's the stress response in your body that's going to essentially allow it or force it to grow bigger, stronger, faster, and replace these old dysfunctional cells with new shiny ones that can do their job more efficiently. So I would say that cold water immersion, ice baths, things like that can be great for inflammation. I would just say separate that from a workout by at least an hour to allow that inflammatory process to get started, and to take hold. I would say also that research on cold water immersion following resistance exercise hasn't been as great. So it's actually showing like a blunted response to resistance training exercise specifically if you follow that immediately with cold water exposure.
Interesting.
So
Yeah.
I would say maybe not on days when you're doing strength training or in the gym, but maybe more beneficial for those endurance training days.
Well, that's great information, although I think it's going to come as kind of bad news for people, because I mean, I'm sure when you've done a 4-hour run in the mountains and you're just finished with 2,000 feet of downhill and you get back to the parking lot and there's a nice ice cold creek there, it's really hard not to wade out into that creek. And now you're saying we shouldn't do that, but no, I'm not blaming you or anything, but I get
Yeah.
it.
I mean, to be fair, I put my feet in the creek after a really long run. I'm just talking about like full body exposure. So maybe
Mm,
don't go all the way in up to your neck in the creek.
yeah. Yeah, I like to go in up to my knees because I've got 70-year-old knees, and so they like that.
Sure.
Well, so what have I left off here? Anything you want to conclude with in terms of that study or anything else we've touched on that you don't feel like we covered as well as you would like to?
No, I think the reason why I sent you this article, honestly, it was just like, look, see, when I was doing all those weird things when I was training
You
for
weren't
Everest,
crazy. You weren't
like
crazy.
there's actually some studies behind it. And now there are a few more. So, I mean, I
Yeah.
think it's great that we have these studies. I think it hasn't been fully figured out like what all of the exact mechanisms are. We know that heat shock proteins are involved. We know that hypoxia inducible factor is involved. Um, but again, we don't know if the same response can be seen with just passive exposure, which is what I used and I found beneficial in my own personal experience. But those studies still need to be done. Studies on female participants still need to be done, and studies on elites or highly performing athletes need to be done. So this is just one paper, and I feel like it's exciting and it opens the can of worms and just like a ton more questions in my mind.
Well, but again, using that N of one study that we were talking about earlier, before you went to Everest, is that you were under a remarkably heavy training load. I mean, like I wasn't being facetious when Seth and I would used to compare notes and just go, how is she doing all this? So you were under a heavy training load. You were, as you said, you're spending 12 or 13 hours a day in a simulated hypoxic environment. You were working a real job
Mhm.
and you were handling this training. Many people can't spend 8 hours a day and handle half the training load you were handling. Now, so we'll have to put aside your probably gifted genetics, but perhaps the heat exposure had some beneficial recovery effect for you or compensated a little bit for helping you handle that amount of stress. I don't know, but it was mind blowing, frankly, to because I've coached a lot of very high level athletes who would have crumpled under that training load, especially with at the added stress of hypoxic environment. So something was working for you.
I bet we could do a whole nother show on just the supplements and the nutrition that I had in
Mm,
leading up to that and
we
like
better.
supporting the training. But I think that was a large part of my recovery. Honestly, if I had to put money on it, I'd say it was the nutrition, the sleep, and probably some of the supplementation that I used at the same time with all of this going on. But yeah.
But you were able to sleep well. I don't remember how high did you end up getting do you recall in your tent at night?
I do. And by accident one night, I accidentally cranked it up to an equivalent of, I think, 20 to 21,000 feet.
Hmm,
And that night
that's
wasn't the best night's sleep. But aside from that, I was sleeping up to about 17, 18,000 feet, which was the same height as where base camp is at.
yeah.
Um, but I managed to sleep pretty well. Like I've always been somebody who just wakes up really early anyway. So I'd wake up at 2 or 3, but that's pretty normal for me. I was still getting about 7 hours of sleep a night undisturbed.
Oh, you're an early to bed person. Like I don't wake up at 2 though. I
Yeah.
wake up at 5, but not 2. Um, when I wake up at 2, I'm usually needing to go back to sleep. But that's a great idea. I'd love to have you back and talk about nutrition and the supplements and whatnot that you did in your build up towards that. And I would assume in your training currently for Tour de Géant, you're going to use some of that experience um, as you go into maybe you're not quite there yet because you're still months and months away. But when the training load gets really high, once you can probably get outside and run more, um, yeah. But you sleep now at what's Mammoth about 8,000, 7,000?
Yep, where I am, I'm sleeping at about 8,000, so
Mhm.
2,500 meters roughly,
Yeah.
which is perfect for training. And I'm still using heat exposure, so I still do
Mhm.
the sauna or the hot tub pretty regularly after workouts. So yeah, doing a lot of the same strategies. Again, I found that I just start to look forward to the heat exposure after a workout. But yeah, definitely the nutrition and supplementation will be more and more focused in the next few months because I've got 5 months between now and the race.
Well, I think as we come into the racing season for a lot of folks, this could be really an interesting topic for us. And yeah, you've had such good luck with all of this that I would love to pick your brain about that. And maybe I'll even ask for some questions from our listeners to pose to you, if that's all right.
Absolutely. I honestly love the Q&A format. I love answering questions for
Okay.
folks because it's always something that people are like, oh, well, I heard about this, or what about this supplement? And I love that. So, yep,
Okay. Well, let's make a date. We'll make that happen.
sounds good.
Right. Well, thanks a lot for taking time out of your afternoon. I really appreciate it. I think this has been super informative. I hope people get inspired by your willingness to think outside the box and try different things. So, um, thanks again.
Yep. Thank you, Scott. I appreciate it.